Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Kristen Harknett. Received her PhD in sociology and demography from Princeton University in 2002 and was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy and Research at UC Berkeley from 2002 until 2004. She served on the faculty of the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania before assuming her current position at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research and teaching interests include unstable work schedules and worker health and well-being, kin and social support, family demography, quantitative methods, and policy evaluation. She is a PI with Professor Daniel Schneider on the SHIFT project, which we'll be hearing more about today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Harknett.
Thank you so much. All right. Thanks for that kind introduction. It is great to be back and to have a chance to share some updates from the SHIFT project. As Casey mentioned, this is a collaboration with Danny Schneider, who is well known to many of you in the room, former faculty member here in sociology at Berkeley. So Danny and I started the SHIFT project back in 2016 to monitor the conditions of low-wage work. And my plan for today is to give you an overview of what the SHIFT project is all about and why we do it. I'll share some research findings related to unstable schedules and how they matter for worker health and well-being. I'll share some research on paid sick leave, which became really important during the global pandemic. And along the way, I'll share some reflections and lessons on harnessing social media for survey data collection. And I'll just end with a few coming attractions. So the SHIFT project studies the evolving conditions in the low-wage service sector in the US. And
I'm just going to change you to, so you have don't have scroll mode. I think it'll be easier for you.
yeah, that'd be great if you can.
Let's see.
Slideshow
There we
is
go. And you
on
can
the
also do, we
map.
can also do slideshow
map
if you want.
is different
Yeah.
than my keystroke on PC. Aha, yes, excellent. Perfect. Thank you very much. So the service sector, to put this in a broader context, is very large and growing. Even after contracting during the pandemic, the service sector still constitutes 17% of all jobs in the US labor market. And from a population perspective, 1 in 10 US adults has a job in the service sector, not just 1 in 10 working adults, but 1 in 10 of all adults. So from a population health perspective, understanding the conditions of work, which are a social determinant of health, is important for understanding both population health more broadly, but also health disparities. And during the pandemic, the conditions in the service sector took on a new type of public health relevance. When many people were able to limit their exposure to coronavirus by working from home and limiting their activities, service sector workers had to continue to report for work in person. And the broader public continued to need groceries and to fill their prescriptions at pharmacies. And so service sector workplaces really became important sites for either transmission or mitigation efforts. And so company practices and policies like paid sick leave took on a heightened public health importance during this time. And another piece of backdrop here, why we're so interested in this service sector. Jobs in the service sector are the quintessential bad jobs in the US labor market. They pay low wages, they offer few benefits, and many workers are working part-time, even though they'd like a full-time schedule. Work schedules, as I'll talk about, are volatile, and so too are earnings. And so you put all of this together, and it's a recipe for economic insecurity. Service sector workers, right before the pandemic struck, 1/4 reported having experienced hunger hardship in the prior year. Almost 1/4 reported last month it was very difficult to pay bills. And over 40% said they'd be unable to cope with a $400 expense shock right before this huge shock of the pandemic struck. And there's been a lot of terrific work on the changing nature of work. And the service sector has really been hit hard by some of these changes and a growing precariousness in the conditions of work. The expectations of the 24/7 economy mean that service sector workers often have to keep their schedules open and available for working at virtually any time. An algorithmic approach to assigning work schedules that aims to really closely align staffing with customer demand means that workers are often scheduled at the very last minute. Their schedules are subject to change with little notice, and workers have very little input into any of this. And when you ask workers what makes for a good job, it goes beyond wages. And a lot of research focuses on the minimum wage or the wages that a worker receives, because that's really easy to measure. But in the SHIFT project, one of the strong recurring themes is that time matters a great deal and work schedules matter a great deal. And workers will tell you that. They say the level of pay is very important for a good job, but so too are predictable hours and the stability and the predictability of pay. This is all super important to bear in mind because the labor market has been quite strong and hourly wages have risen over time in the retail sector. But this isn't the whole story. At the same time, weekly work hours have been on the decline. And because these workers are paid by the hour, it's both their wage and their number of hours that determines their paycheck. But in the SHIFT project, we have tried to draw attention, even going beyond wages and number of hours. We've tried to draw attention to the importance of the regularity of work schedules, predictability and instability, because those features are important not just for job quality, but also for quality of life. The ability to plan anything really depends on knowing whether and when you're going to be working. So the ability to combine work and school, to combine one low-wage job with another to make ends meet, the ability to parent or form or maintain relationships, all really hinge on knowing when you have time away from work. And many in the service sector do not. And so understanding the connections between these kinds of volatile work scheduling conditions and some bottom line outcomes of workers' health and well-being is a question of importance, but one that you really can't answer with existing data sets because they just don't capture this granular information on job quality. So the SHIFT project over the past 7 years has set out to fill a gap in what we know about job conditions in the service sector. And we've collected survey data over time from hourly workers employed in the service sector. We've had some geographic oversamples, and importantly, the data we collect, which I'll talk about in more detail, surveys workers nested within named employers. And this becomes important because it gives us the opportunity to compare and contrast practices from one company to the next and gives us some nice analytic leverage.
Just a question about,
Yeah.
has the CPS and the Bureau of Labor Statistics kind of recognize some of the changes going on? Are they moving slowly towards asking about some of these issues? Or is it really, I know you've gone a lot deeper, of course, but are they changing like how regular is your schedule and that sort of thing? They don't have to ask a lot of things that are required to by law. They also ask about health insurance, things like that.
Yeah, so there has been some moves, some drives to add questions, but the CPS really undercounts things like involuntary part-time, and there are questions about irregular work hours are asked in such a way that it just really doesn't capture it well. So to date, the best source of data is the NLSY, I would say, has information on advance notice and a couple of other schedule dimensions, but the sample isn't huge. And so our data collection still gives us some ability to make comparisons across companies, across geographies, which you can't do in the NLSY. But it's nice that those data exist because we do use it to do some benchmarking to validate our data. I should have said you should feel free to jump in anytime if you have other questions along the way. So the way that we gather data from large samples of workers nested within named companies is to harness social media. And I will spend a few minutes talking about our approach because it's somewhat unconventional. So we take advantage of the ad targeting capabilities of Facebook, and we target survey recruitment ads to individuals who are employed at particular companies. So this screenshot shows you Facebook's ad manager, and in particular, the portion of the ad manager that allows you to display an ad just to workers who are employed at Lowe's or Best Buy or Bed Bath & Beyond. So we take advantage of this targeting capability to put our ad in front of just that set of workers who we want to hear from. You can also use ad targeting to target to a particular age group or geographic location. You can target an ad to new parents. So there are a lot of different options, but the employer targeting for our purposes has really been key.
And this is not restricted to people identified it by the Facebook, someone uses their algorithms to identify it.
Yeah, so they have to, Facebook's ad system has to in some way have categorized a person as a Best Buy employee.
You just say another word about that. Do you think that you're really getting people who work at Best Buy? Do you
Yeah, okay,
a
so
real sample of those people?
So in the early days of our data collection, we were worried we might not get who we thought we were getting. And so we did a lot of testing where we wouldn't assume just because we target our ad to Best Buy that that's who we're going to get. So then the very first question would ask, where do you work? And then we were through that process able to confirm that 99-point-something% of the time we were getting the person we thought we were getting. There's also a recent publication, maybe in demographic research, Dennis, you might know this, I'm not sure, where some researchers, I think Emilio Zagani was one of the co-authors perhaps on this, but they confirmed that when you use ad targeting, you get who you think you're going to get on demographic attributes and a set of other.
And are you missing people? For example, is every Best Buy employee on Facebook?
Yeah, so if I will talk more about the data validation and who we think we're missing, but these are great questions to bring up as they occur to you. So we have external data that tells us how many employees work at Best Buy. And so we can go through company by company and see what share of workers has Facebook identified. And overall, I think Facebook has identified somewhere in the vicinity of 40 to 50% of all of the Best Buy employees in this external database.
But you want them to be representative, right?
Well, I'll talk about that. So we do want them to give us valid information on relationships between their work conditions and health. But we cannot guarantee that a univariate statistic on, that we're going to get the average age of the workforce exactly right, for instance. But I do have some slides here where I'll talk about that this is a non-probability sample. We are attentive to potential biases and we try to use it in a way that we think is valid and appropriate. And we would caution, against making inferences about the prevalence of a disease from our data, for instance. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How expensive is it to do a survey via Facebook?
Oh, sorry, what?
Is it expensive to do a survey via Facebook or?
It's gotten more expensive over time. In the early years, we could get survey responses for less than $2. The costs have crept up and now our responses are more like $9 to $10 per. And that doesn't really include our time, which we've kind of volunteered to this effort, but just in terms of the cost of placing the ad, it's about $9 to $10 per.
And what's the response rate?
I'll talk about that in just a minute.
Right, for how long the interview? $10 per.
A 15-minute survey, basically. All right, here we go. So what we do is we target our ads to people who work at a particular employer. The ad is designed to look like an employee at that company, and it names that company. If the individual sees the ad and clicks on it, they're taken to a Qualtrics survey that asks about their job conditions. So the survey can be taken on a smartphone, a tablet, or a computer. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. We wrote up a lot of details on our data collection approach and some of the validation steps we've taken in this article in sociological methods and research. And I'll share some of the highlights from that, and then happy to go into it more in the Q&A. To give you a sense of the types of employers that are included in our study, this is a subset of the logos: grocery, pharmacy, retail, apparel, big box stores, and fast food. We have been at this for a long time. We've collected 12 repeat cross sections of data. Each one of those is like 5,000 to 10,000 survey responses. And we've got some geographic oversamples represented in these blue boxes, an embedded panel study where we follow workers over time. Right now we're in the field with our 13th repeat cross section, and we're following up with our 3rd and 4th panel. Okay, some of the questions you already anticipated about the performance. So not everybody who sees the ad is going to click on it. About 7% do. Not everybody who clicks on the ad is going to fill in our survey. About 18% do. So overall, the response rate is pretty dismal. Only 1% of people who see our ad fill in the survey. So we want to be attentive to non-response bias. I'll talk about it in brief. But to put this in a broader context, even traditional methods of survey data collection are really struggling with low response rates, with Pew reporting in recent years getting response rates 9%. So this problem is not confined just to us and our method.
You mean that's the response rate for surveys through social media or overall?
Total.
Like
Overall,
traditional?
from random digital surveys, 9%. But in any case, in our study, we've got some quality controls. There's an attention filter in case somebody's just filling in garbage, and we throw out about 7% of responses because they're inattentive. We throw out people who speed through. We have some safeguards to prevent people from taking the survey over and over again and to screen out bots. But what results is definitely a non-probability sample. And so we want to be attentive to the ways that our sample might be biased, and we want to use it appropriately. The article that I mentioned enshrines some of this information, and I can go into more detail in the Q&A. But in brief, we might be worried not everybody's on Facebook. Josh anticipated not everyone's identified as a Best Buy employee. So there is some non-coverage of the sampling frame. This isn't our largest concern. Facebook saturation is really quite high. The working age population, 80% are active on social media. Most of them are active daily. So this is a concern, but not the largest one. There is response bias where we get disproportionate survey responses from women and from white non-Hispanics. That's fairly easy to adjust for by constructing and applying weights that align demographics with workers in the service sector in the American Community Survey. So we're also not too concerned about this. The thornier issue is response bias on unobserved attributes that may bias the estimates that we want to make. So we can't thoroughly address this concern, but we have done a lot of A/B testing for bias to see if our relationships are robust to trying to purposely get lots of disgruntled workers and lots of proud workers. And by and large, so far, we've been reassured by the results that the relationships of interest don't seem to be biased by a set of unobservables that we've tried to test for. We've
The
also
idea
done,
There is like, you start with this, like, are you mad at your employer for the
Exactly.
survey?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Or do you love your job and want to recommend it to others and they need to get the same
Precisely.
results? Okay.
yeah, precisely. Yeah, so we've done that kind of testing, but then the other thing that we've done is benchmarking against the NLSY, against the CPS. We set out to collect our own data because there's stuff we wanted to know about that isn't contained in those data sets, but there's overlap. We ask about wages and so do they. We ask about job tenure and so do they. And our benchmarks against the gold standard data sources has been some of the most reassuring information that we can we're very in line with the probability data sources on things like the relationship between wages or tenure and wages. So I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'll zoom ahead. The other way that we have tried to appropriately use data from a non-probability sample is to take any univariates with a big grain of salt, but instead to really lean into comparative research designs. And so I'll give a couple of examples of how we've used difference in differences designs so that even if there is some bias in levels, we're still going to net out that bias in making some comparisons. Okay, but before I move to results, are there any lingering questions, burning questions about data and sample? Okay. So the raison d'etre of the SHIFT project for the first several years was really learning more about unpredictable and unstable work schedules. So I'm going to share some findings there. So descriptively, other data sets weren't asking about on-call shifts, or is your shift changed at the last minute? And many, if not most, of service sector workers get their schedules with short notice and experience timing changes at the last minute. There's a lot of unpredictability and instability in schedules. And we wanted to understand, how does this matter for health and well-being and parenting? And other data sets really couldn't answer the question. Press accounts like this one really gave the strong sense that an unstable schedule wreaks havoc on a person's life. This Starbucks worker made a really pretty decent hourly wage, but her schedule was all over the place. She had to drop out of school, her relationship broke up, her child's care arrangements were really unstable. But this is just one person's story. With the SHIFT project, we were able to more systematically trace these same kinds of relationships. And we have shown that when your schedule is more unstable and more unpredictable, going from left to right, workers report more material hardships, more hunger, more trouble paying rent and paying medical bills. Workers report more unhappiness, worse sleep quality, more psychological distress. And we also trace connections between parents' unstable schedules and children's behavioral problems. So there do seem to be spillover associations, at least, between parents' unstable schedules and how kids are doing. So motivated by this notion that when your schedule is assigned at the last minute or changed at the last minute, that's going to make workers' lives really chaotic, and so too the lives of their kids. Some cities attempted to rein in these practices by passing Fair Work Week legislation. And in fact, San Francisco was the very first city to do so in 2015. And this was one of the motivations for the SHIFT project. We wanted to be able to study what happens when all of a sudden overnight workers go from not getting advance notice to getting 2 weeks advance notice. How does that affect their sleep quality? How does that affect their mental health? But there was no data to study San Francisco's Retail Workers' Bill of Rights. 2 years later, Seattle passed an even more expansive version of this Fair Work Week law. And the SHIFT project at that point was ready to study the effects. This is a really good opportunity to see there's this exogenous change that was intended to make schedules a lot more stable. So a couple of key stipulations in the law Workers in Seattle who were employed in retail and food service had to get 2 weeks of advance notice of their work schedule. If they didn't, then their employer had to pay them extra. It's sort of like overtime pay, but it's called predictability pay. And for the inconvenience of being called in at the last minute or your schedule's canceled, there's some predictability pay that workers are entitled to. And it's intended to discourage employers from using these just-in-time scheduling practices. Now, in principle, the Seattle's law is called the Secure Scheduling Ordinance, and in principle, it's expected to reduce schedules assigned at short notice and a set of other types of schedule instability. And we look to see whether it did have the intended effects. We also sum all these things up into a schedule unpredictability scale that I'll show. Then we have the opportunity to see when schedules become more stable, are workers better off in some ways that we think might be sensitive, might move in the short term. So we're not going to pick up changes in like cardiovascular health, but our study is not well designed for that. But maybe we can pick up changes in mental health and in sleep quality. And so we study this law and we do find that it has both the intended effects on stabilizing schedules and also that it improves worker well-being. So I know I'm not doing great on time. So the research design here, we took a snapshot of work conditions for Seattle workers before and after this law went into effect. But the world is changing aside from this law. So we also have a snapshot of workers in other large cities with progressive labor market environments like Seattle that represent the secular trend of what we would expect to happen in the absence of a law. So we use our Facebook targeted ads. We get a snapshot. What's your schedule like, Seattle worker, before the law, after the law? Comparison city workers, what's your schedule like before the law, after the law, but the law doesn't apply to you?
In the same companies?
Exact same companies. So one of the cool things about our design is we're able to look at Home Depot workers in Seattle compared to Home Depot workers in all the other places. And we use a difference in differences research design. So maybe our sample is biased and maybe we don't have the exact right percentage of workers who get their schedules on short notice, but I don't have any reason to think that there's going to be a differential bias either before and after the law or in Seattle versus Baltimore. So we look at the change over time in Seattle, the change over time everywhere else for workers at the exact same companies, and then the difference is the estimated effect of this law.
Is it the same population of people, or could there also be a compositional change in who actually stays on the job because conditions are better?
Exactly. Great question. We look at that in the article. Yeah.
Are your people the same or both? No,
It's both. So we do re-interview, but there's so much turnover that there would be a bias if you were only re-interviewing. So we replenish the sample at each snapshot. And that compositional question is a really important one. We did want to make sure once conditions got better, maybe the workers would have better, higher levels of education or something like that. There weren't major compositional shifts. That's something we report on in the paper. But what I show here are some of the main results showing that in gray, it's the secular trend. So baseline is a 0 point. And we're plotting changes from baseline. And maybe we can just focus on the top. That's the unpredictability scale that sums everything up together. How unpredictable is your schedule? Over time, the gray line, the comparison city, is pretty flat. Things don't change much in the absence of a law. But in Seattle, those types of unpredictability are reduced substantially after the law goes into effect. Then we also see that for Seattle workers, some of these estimates are noisy, but we do see that sleep quality improves for Seattle workers, but not for workers everywhere else. Hardship Material hardship is reduced for Seattle workers, but stays about the same for workers at the same companies and other places. So this was a pretty cool, satisfying application of our data collection. We were able to get a large enough sample that we can look in a focused way in a particular geography. You can't do this with the NLSY or any other data set. The paper also uses the change in the law as an instrument to try to estimate what is the causal effect of schedule unpredictability on mental health and sleep. And we do this simulation where we show this is the status quo. Workers report on average 3 types of unstable schedules. And if we zeroed that out and made their schedules perfectly stable and predictable, there'd be really huge dividends in terms of happiness, sleep, and hardship. So that's the example of how we use social media to collect targeted survey data from workers at particular companies, allowing us to zero in on people covered by a law that only covers retail and food service and only covers large employers. So it's a very handy matching of the sampling approach with the policy change. And the fact that we do it all in-house gives us a high degree of control. So we oversample Seattle, so we can take advantage of this change. I know I'm not doing great on time, so I can skip over paid sick leave and just go to the end if you'd like to preserve time for
Why don't you give us
questions.
A minute or two of paid sick leave and show us
Okay.
what it's about.
Okay, this is much more brief. Because we collect data from named employers, we could show that at the beginning of the pandemic, there's a lot of variation in employers who do or don't offer paid sick leave. So almost all Costco workers get paid sick leave. Almost no Dollar General workers get paid sick leave. So that's a kind of nice feature of the data, is being able to compare across companies. But also we were able to, much in the same way that we did in Seattle, where there was a change that affected workers in one place but not others, there was public pressure placed on Olive Garden at the beginning of the pandemic. They were called out as one of the bad actors. You don't offer paid sick leave during a pandemic, that's bananas. And then overnight, they changed their policy and they said, we will offer it. We're going to give all our workers paid sick leave. Often companies say they're going to do something and they don't follow through. But we had been collecting data from Olive Garden before the pandemic and before this change was announced. So we were able to use a very similar research design, a difference in differences research design, to confirm that in fact, after Olive Garden said, we're gonna extend paid sick leave benefits, we see this 50 percentage point increase in Olive Garden workers getting paid sick leave, no change for other food service employers. And then we can go one step farther and see, does it have a public health benefit? So when a company changes their policy overnight, and now you can stay home from work and get paid if you're sick, then do we see a reduction in what's called presenteeism, or showing up to work even though you're sick, which is obviously a huge problem during a pandemic. And we do indeed see that after Olive Garden expanded paid sick leave, we see a reduction in Olive Garden workers who show up for work even though they're sick during a pandemic. So that's a relief, both for the workers and for anyone who likes to eat at Olive Garden. Okay, so I just have 2 slides left. So reflections, harnessing social media for data collection. It provides new opportunities. So there's no sampling frame that would allow us to survey Olive Garden workers in particular, but Facebook provides such a sampling frame. And so there are opportunities there. The Facebook ad manager infrastructure allows us to do all of this data collection in-house. We don't have to hire a survey firm. So we have a ton of control. This is both a pro and a con, because we do a lot of the work in-house, but when the pandemic struck, we added questions about the pandemic, like right before we went into the field. So it's pretty nice to have that amount of control over the data collection. A nice feature of this social media approach to survey recruitment is that it lends itself to nested data, where we've got 145 different companies and then hundreds of survey responses nested within each of those companies, which gives us some nice opportunities. I talked about the non-probability samples and the way that we've thought about using them responsibly and carefully. And one note of caution for those, other people have approached us over time and said, we want to do this for this topic or that topic. And we have found in our testing over time, it really helps to name employer and to make your photo look like a particular employer. And our ads that were more generic performed a lot less well. So although this is a cool opportunity, it really works best if you're targeting some attribute that's highly salient to the individual. So that's one of our lessons learned.
One that didn't. Somebody can.
Yeah, and Nick can share this too. So in one of our ad campaigns, I think we intended to target that, well, so that I'll skip that example and say we did do A/B testing that was intentional, where we tested like a generic ad, work in retail and food service, take a survey. The clicks went way down compared to work at Domino's Pizza and you look and you are delivering a pizza. We got way more clicks for that.
Can you give an example of a research area that other people came to you with that you said, oh, that's probably not going to work because you can't make it salient?
Yeah, so I want to compare like some kind of health outcome in Baltimore versus Boston. And you just want like a city sample, then you don't have any hook if you're just going by geography. So I think it needs to be a little bit more fine-grained and attached to people's identities. This might make sense.
Sports team. Red Sox
Maybe.
fan.
Yeah, I've thought about that. Yeah. Okay, so last slide is just future directions of the SHIFT project. So we've got a ton of data and we have a lot of papers in the works and also a lot of collaborations. And so if any of this kind of resonates with you, please follow up. It's been great to expand what we can do with the data by bringing in people with different sets of interests. A couple of future directions. We ask the workers who respond to our survey about the store number, their store location, and we've taken great pains to match their store numbers with the actual street address. So now we know exactly where about half of our sample works. And that allows us to make comparisons of franchises and non-franchises, bring in a lot of different external data sources that tell us things about the density of the work setting, like how large it is and how many people are in there. So we're excited about some of the work we can do linking with other external data sources. We're also part of our team's embarking on some in-depth interviews starting this fall to supplement all we've learned from the survey with a real focus on technology in workplaces, which we've been asking about, but some of the nuances are hard to get in a closed-ended survey. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there to make sure we have a couple minutes for questions. I thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much for bearing with us and giving your late start and plenty of time. So let's just kick it off. We have questions that were asked already, but priority to the in-person questioners. Right.
Have you thought about expanding and using a similar approach with like formal or not like huge 500+ employee companies, also in the services sector? So I'm thinking of like people in the gig economy who may have like selected into that line of work because of having more control of their schedule. Just curious if you've thought about doing kind of those two like different ways of participating in that line of work, or are they so kind of distinct that it's not worth doing that?
Yeah, so the question, so the question was whether we had thought about sampling either smaller employers or on-demand gig economy work. And this method works best for the large employers because we have a large enough audience size that it's just, the recruitment works better that way. The smaller, more independent employers, then we run into this salience issue. We actually literally run in each of our waves dozens and dozens of ads. Each one is targeted to the particular employer. So if we're going for small employers, the proliferation would be too great and the audiences would get too small. That said, there are a couple of workforce scheduling companies that have administrative data, and they focus mostly on the smaller businesses. And we're engaged in talks with one of these companies to access their data so that we can look at some of these scheduling features for smaller employers. The gig economy, we have done some targeted ads to people at TaskRabbit, Uber, and Lyft, and we do have a report on that. We don't have a very robust sample size, but that is possible to do with this method. That was a full answer.
Are you thinking about doing any future research involving, say, women in the service sector in areas that are about to probably have abortion restrictions?
Oh, yeah. Good
Question?
question. Oh, sorry, repeating the question. So the question was about abortion restrictions and whether there's anything we could learn here. We don't have a super intentional strategy on that, but we do have Dick's Sporting Goods, for instance. They were one of the companies that announced that they'd pay for travel for medical procedures. And I think that there are a handful of other companies who have announced similar changes. So I don't know if it's something you're interested in, we should talk about it, because I think we might have some ability to look at the companies that have made statements suggesting that they'd be supportive in helping their employees. But we don't have any questions. One of the limits in doing an online survey is in part length. You know, we can only ask so much. And also we don't ask many personal questions because of the mode. So we don't ask a lot about like sexual activity or anything like that.
I just want to say, first of all, I remember talking to Danny about this many years ago and thinking this would be fantastic. It's become triple fantastic. So just a follow-up question. You've gotten responses from local governments and state governments. And you've gotten responses from some of these employers who are either interested in talking to you or whatever.
Yeah, so there's one employer in particular, IKEA. One of the IKEA human resources managers from Sweden got in touch with us after we published an op-ed in the Washington Post. IKEA is a high road employer. They already offer better wages, more notice than their competitors, but workers don't have a lot of control over when they work. And IKEA wanted to do better. And so we have been meeting with them weekly for a couple of years.
Wow.
And we're just about to launch an intervention in a set of a half dozen IKEA stores where their scheduling app is now going to introduce new features, allowing workers to swap with one another without a manager having to be involved, to pick up a shift or to say, I can't work this shift, to update their availability. And then we have a set of comparison stores that are going to be status quo, don't get those features. And then we're going to see what difference it makes for their workers. So that's one company that's approached us in a positive way. Every once in a while, we get a menacing email from a company that doesn't like what we're doing and their lawyers. But so far, thankfully, that hasn't come to anything.
Okay, we still have a bunch of questions. Let's do a couple of questions without answers, and then you can answer whichever one you want. We'll do all the
Okay.
questions- we'll get all the questions, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, Casey, ask your question.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating talk. And I'm sure you've thought about this already, but I was just wondering whether your weighting strategy can adjust for how often a respondent uses Facebook. You could imagine a story where people who use Facebook more often are more likely to respond to the survey. And people who use Facebook more often may also have more free time, which may influence how they feel about them.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
question
great
number one.
question.
Question number two, Marguerite.
Good question.
Yes, talking about IKEA, have you thought about given the research design, it's really easy to export to other countries, in particular countries which have a very different
Yeah.
work culture and law, working law system.
These are great questions. They almost don't need answers. They're such good questions. And, Juana.
Yeah.
Oh, was there another question? Where?
In the back, Maria.
Oh, okay, brilliant.
So Omer Gersing online is asking, Gavin Newsom recently signed a bill for rights for fast food workers in California. Do you know the details of this and is it good legislation?
Yeah, okay, wow, okay. So the
Whatever you
first
want.
question,
You have 20
I can be quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, really quick. Casey's question was about the frequency of Facebook use, and we added a question that asks people about frequency of use so that we can wait for that. So that's in the works. Margalee's question, sorry, was about whether we have any plans to expand this internationally. I think it would be super, and I think it's doable. We don't have plans to do it. If somebody else wants to do it, come talk to us. Last question was about Gavin Newsom on Labor Day signed the FAST Act that allows fast food workers to bargain, sectoral bargaining. And the SHIFT project actually produced a research report on fast food workers' conditions in California to inform the policy making around this, showing that fast food workers earn substantially less than other retail workers. And so I think this is really a new piece of legislation, and we'll see what effects it has. But certainly the rationale that fast food workers were really at the bottom of the heap is supported by the data.
Thanks so much, Kristen. It was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.